This video is going to demonstrate how to create a connection to a SQL Server database using ADO.NET, specifically the connection object. And I'm just going to demonstrate how to set up that connection string using a middle tier class and passing that information to my interface, which you can see here. This is a Windows application, and opening the connection. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to forge a connection between this Windows application and our SQL Server database. And I'm just going to use the pubs database that is sitting in my SQL 2012 server on my local machine. The easiest way to do that is to have the machine create the connection string for me, and for me to just copy and paste that into my application. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up Server Explorer here, and from the menus that would be on the View menu and Server Explorer, but I had it pinned to the side. Server Explorer, as you can see, has a Data Connections section, and what I'm going to do is right-click on Data Connections and say Add Connection. And I'm going to choose my SQL Server, so it's going to take it a second here and populate my servers in the drop-down because I have two versions of SQL installed on the same machine, SQL Server 2008 R2 and SQL Server 2012. So I'm just going to let it populate itself here. And then once it does that, as it just did, I'm going to choose my SQL Server, and I'm going to leave it with Windows Authentication since I'm logged in as administrator. And I'm going to select the database name from the drop-down, and I'm going to choose pubs 2012 here as my database. And when I test connection, it says the test connection succeeded. And actually that's kind of a moot point, because if my database appears in this drop-down, it means that it is communicating and connected to that server. So I'm going to just say OK, and when that occurs, then I'm going to get a connection right here to Karen Office SQL 2012 Karen pubs 2012, and I can drill that down and I can see tables and I can see stored procedures and I can see all the metadata about that database as if I were in Management Studio. But what I'm really interested in is the connection information that was generated by this Server Explorer connection so that I could use it in my application to connect to this database using ADO.NET. So I'm going to right click on this connection and I'm going to go to Properties, and I'll expand that out a little bit. And when I look at the properties for this connection, you can see that one of the properties is called Connection String. And if I scroll this out a little bit more, you can see that that property says data source equals Karen Office SQL 2012 initial catalog pubs 2012. So here we have the name of the server as the data source, the initial catalog is the name of the database, and integrated security equals true means use Windows security and just authenticate me to this SQL server based upon my local Windows login, which is administrator. So what I'm going to do to make my life easy, I'm going to just copy this connection string, the whole thing. I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to just keep it in my clipboard for now and use it in just a moment. So I'm just going to keep that there. So the next thing I want to do then, and the way that we're going to create our connections in this class for all of our sample applications, is we are going to be using what's called a middle tier class. And that middle tier class is just going to be a C# class that's going to be responsible for holding all the ADO.NET code and going to allow us to instantiate all the ADO.NET objects and encapsulate them in that middle tier C# class. So the first thing I'm going to do before I create that middle tier class is I'm going to go into this file called appconfig. Now this is a brand new Windows project. The only thing that I've done is I've just placed some controls on the default form. But you see I have this file called app-config. If you don't have that file, you can certainly create it by right-clicking and saying Add, New Item. And what it's actually called is an application configuration file. So you can see that here. And you would not change the name of it. You would leave it app-config, in this case app1config, because I already have one. But that would be the way you would add it if you don't already have it. So I'm just going to cancel since I already have it. This app-config file is actually an XML file. As you can see, it's XML. It has a configuration section, and it's got this startup section, and it eventually will have a lot more than just that. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to add my connection strings section to this app config file. So what I'm going to do in my app config file is I'm going to add in a connection strings section. So I'm going to do that now, and you can see that IntelliSense will help me do that. So connection strings, and inside the connection strings section I'm going to actually add the information that I need to connect to that pubs SQL Server database. So to do that, I need an add element, and it's going to have some attributes. The first one will be name, and this is going to be the name of my connection string that I'm going to use inside of my program. So I'm going to call it pubs connection. And then the other part of this that I need, I'm going to go past that quote, and you see there's a connection string, pardon me, element, attribute. I'm going to add that in, and I'm going to actually just paste in that connection string that I've been holding in my clipboard all this time, the same one that we stole from our Server Explorer just a moment ago. I'm going to close this so we can see a little bit more of it. So I'm just going to paste that right in there, which I did. So you can see that's my connection string. The next thing that we could add is provider information, but I'm not going to add that in this particular instance because it's not required. You can have as many connection string elements that you wish inside of this connection string section of your app config file. And that makes it very easy, because if you should change servers, or your database changes name, or you need to change the way you authenticate to SQL Server here, you can do that in one place and it will be in effect for your entire application. The next thing I'm going to do then is I'm going to look at my Solution Explorer, and I'm going to add a reference to my list of references, and the reference I'm going to add is going to be a reference that will allow me to programmatically access this app config file from my middle tier class. So I'm going to right click here and I'm going to add a reference, and it's going to be to something called system.configuration. So I'm going to look here in assemblies, in the framework, and I'm going to look down here for system.configuration, and there it is right there. So I want to add that in. I'm going to click on it and say OK. And there it is. So now the next thing I want to do, so I've added my entry into the app config file with my connection string. I'm going to actually add my middle tier class. So I'm going to go up to my project and add a new item. And at the top here is what I want. I'm going to add a class, make sure that it's C#, and I'm going to call it DB middle tier. I'll just add that in, and I get an empty class. Inside of this class, I want to make sure that I add in the proper libraries that are going to allow me to use ADO.NET, and specifically in ADO.NET, the SQL Server tools. It's called the SQL client. And also that new system.configuration that I added in just a moment ago. So let's start with that. So I'll add in system.configuration. I'm going to add in something called system.data, which is the library that contains all the generic ADO.NET data tools, objects, such as data sets and data rows and all kinds of things that we're going to be using this quarter. And then also I'm going to add in the specific SQL Server library called the SQL client. So there it is down there. So we want system.data and system.data.SQL client. Then what I'm going to do is inside my class, first thing I'm going to do is instantiate a connection object. One of the primary objects in ADO.NET, and the first one that we always need to use if we're going to communicate between an application, either a web or a Windows application and a database, is a connection object. So I'm going to instantiate a SQL connection. So this is specifically for SQL Server, SQL connection. I'm going to call it scon and instantiate that. Then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a constructor here. And inside that constructor, I'm going to set the connection string of my connection object. So we're going to set that connection string property. So scon.connectionString is equal to configuration manager, or actually configuration, let's see, I have to refresh my memory here. Configuration manager. There we go, dot connection string. Sorry about that, I couldn't remember the name of it. I had to cheat. And then inside of connection strings, it's actually a collection. So what we're doing is we're actually going into, with configuration manager, we're actually going into this app config file, and inside of the connection strings area, remember I told you could have as many of these connection strings as you want. We want this one. We want the one whose name is pubs connection. So I'm just going to copy that and I'm going to put it here inside of quotes, pubs connection, and string it. So at this point in our middle tier we have a constructor that's going to set the connection string to our database as we indicated in our app config file. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to let's write a method in here that will open this connection. And so we're going to make that a public method. We're going to call that, we're going to say this method is going to return a SQL connection object, and we're going to call it open connection. And it's not going to take any data. And we're going to have a try, and we're going to have a catch, and we're going to throw SQL exceptions. And so it's going to look something like this. Let me just show you what it will look like. It's going to look like this. So we're going to catch SQL exceptions and also exceptions, just general exceptions. So I'm going to, instead of reinventing the wheel, copy it. This is from one of my finished applications. So I don't have to write all of that code because my recording time will run out. And so what I'm going to do is actually open the connection and return it. So I'm going to return, I'm going to say scon.open which is the method that actually forges the connection between our database and our application and makes it live. And then we're going to return as con.